Hi and welcome to Occasional Fish. Today I'll be showing you how I made baked dairy-free donuts by substituting only a few ingredients from King Arthur's recipe. I've linked the original recipe down below and included the variations that I made. So let's get started. To a bowl, I added 4 tablespoons of coconut oil. I didn't melt mine because I wanted to make sure the measurements were accurate. When substituting coconut oil, you want to make sure that it's in solid form so that it more closely measures out to a typical stick of butter. Next, I added in both sugars, which will be a half cup of granulated white sugar and a third cup of light brown sugar. I poured in a fourth cup of vegetable oil, and I mixed all of it together until it was smooth. Using the coconut oil instead of butter really sped up the mixing, but you could always use vegan butter instead if you prefer it. Once it was smooth, I added 2 eggs and beat them into the mixture. I went out of order in the recipe a little bit and added my vanilla right after beating in the eggs, but it turned out just fine. The recipe called for about a teaspoon, so I eyeballed that and put it into the mixture. Next, I added in a 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, but now is when I went a little bit off course. I ran out of baking powder, so I had to compensate with some baking soda and vinegar. If you followed the recipe, it would have 1½ teaspoons of baking powder. Finally, I added in about 3/4 teaspoon of salt. I eyeballed the amount because I didn't want to use another measuring spoon, so that is why there is a shadow of my hand instead of a little measuring spoon. I mixed everything all together until it was nice and smooth before moving on to the flour and the oat milk. You will alternate adding the flour with the milk. I added my flour by the third, and you will ultimately use 2 2/3 cups of all-purpose flour and 1 cup of milk. To make this recipe dairy-free, I used oat milk that I made from scratch by blending oats and water with a little bit of salt. I omitted the nutmeg that the recipe called for because I don't actually have it in my pantry, and I also never really use it. I'm not a huge fan of nutmeg in my recipes, but you can add it if that's what you like. You would add it right after the baking soda, and the recipe calls for a half teaspoon to a teaspoon of it. As a quick mention, I typically use random kitchen utensils when baking. For instance, here I'm just using a large fork. You can most certainly use a spatula if you like. You don't have to copy me at all. I just like to use whatever is most convenient, and this time it happened to be this large fork. Baking is definitely a science, but it's also highly customizable, so it's your kitchen, do what you like. I mixed the dough until it was quite thick and left a noticeable dent when I drew out my fork. Now I'm spraying a donut pan with cooking spray to prevent the donuts from sticking. I will be using half of this dough to make 6 vanilla donuts. So to do that, I'll spoon the dough into the wells until they're about a 1/4 inch shy of the rim. It doesn't have to be exact, but do try to make them even. Once the pan is filled, transfer the donuts to an oven heated to 375 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 to 12 minutes. Once they're done, remove them from the oven and wait 5 to 7 minutes before turning them out onto a wire rack. I like to line my wire rack with parchment paper, but you can just put it directly on the rack if you prefer. I added a few tablespoons of cocoa powder to the other half of the dough to make chocolate donuts. The recipe didn't specify doing that, but I figured I'd try it out, and they turned out great. I followed the same steps as before, and after a few minutes, I got chocolate dairy-free donuts. You can frost the donuts or sprinkle them with powdered sugar. You can even top them with sprinkles if you like. The options are definitely limitless. I hope you enjoyed today's recipe. Even though it's not fully one of my own creations, I still had fun adjusting to make these donuts more accessible to those who can't have dairy, or maybe those who like to try different variations out. Please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one.